They say history is written by the winners, and in Richard III's case, that couldn't be more true. For over 500 years, his name has been dragged through the mud, branded a tyrant, a usurper, even a murderer of children. But what if the story we've been told isn't the full truth? This is the story of Richard III, the last king of England to die in battle, and the only one ever found under a parking lot. Richard III was born on October 2nd, 1452, in Northamptonshire, England, at Fotheringay Castle. He was the 11th child and 4th surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His family belonged to the House of York, one of the two powerful branches of the royal Plantagenet dynasty. The other was the House of Lancaster. The two families were locked in a long and bitter struggle for the English crown, a conflict that would later be known as the Wars of the Roses. From the moment of Richard's birth, England was already at war with itself. The Wars of the Roses had begun because both the York and Lancaster branches believed they had a stronger claim to the throne. The ruling king, when Richard was born, was Henry VI, a Lancastrian, but he was known to be weak and mentally unstable, and many nobles in England believed he was unfit to rule. Richard's father, the Duke of York, was one of the most powerful men in the country. He felt it was his duty and his right to take the crown for himself. The civil war between the two houses was not just about bloodlines, it was also about power, land, and survival. Battles were fought across the country, families took sides, nobles shifted loyalties, and thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. The conflict created an unstable and dangerous environment for anyone close to the throne. For young Richard, this meant that his early years were shaped by war, loss, and the uncertainty of royal ambition. When Richard was just 8 years old, in 1460, his father was killed in battle. The Duke of York had claimed the throne, but was defeated and beheaded by Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard's older brother Edward, then just 18, took up his father's claim and continued the fight. Within a year, Edward led the Yorkist army to victory at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. After this victory, Edward was crowned King Edward IV in 1461. With Edward on the throne, Richard's life changed. Now the younger brother of the king, he was given titles, land, and responsibilities. As a boy, he was sent to live and train in the household of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was known as the Kingmaker because of his great influence in court and his role in helping Edward win the throne. Under Warwick's care, young Richard learned about politics, war, and noble life. But the alliance between Warwick and the York kings would not last. When Richard was a teenager, the political situation became unstable again. Edward IV lost the throne briefly in 1470 when Warwick turned against him and helped restore Henry VI to the crown. Richard and Edward were forced to flee to Burgundy, but just 6 months later they returned to England, raised an army, and retook the throne. Warwick was killed in battle, and Henry VI was captured and later died in the Tower of London, likely murdered. With this, the House of York was back in power and more determined than ever to keep it. Richard was now a trusted and experienced young nobleman. In 1471, at only 18 years old, he was given command of a wing of Edward's army at the Battle of Tewkesbury. It was a key victory that crushed the Lancastrian cause and solidified Edward VI's rule. For his loyalty and bravery, Richard was rewarded with great honours. He became Duke of Gloucester and was granted vast estates in the north of England. He was also made Lord High Admiral and Lord of the North, responsible for maintaining law and order across large and sometimes rebellious regions. Throughout Edward VI's reign, Richard remained one of his closest supporters. He governed from the north effectively, gained the loyalty of local nobles and towns, and developed a reputation for fairness and justice. He married Anne Neville, the daughter of the Earl of Warwick, in 1472. This marriage helped Richard secure more land and influence. Anne and Richard had one son, Edward of Middleham, born a few years later. For more than a decade, Richard served his brother faithfully, but everything changed in 1483 when Edward IV died unexpectedly. He was only 40 years old. His eldest son, also named Edward, was just 12 years old and too young to rule on his own. In his will, Edward IV named Richard as Lord Protector of the realm, meaning Richard would act as guardian and ruler until the young king came of age. At first, Richard seemed to accept this duty with honour. He travelled to London to oversee his nephew's coronation and began removing corrupt advisers from the court. Within weeks, rumours began to spread. Richard claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been unlawful, and therefore his children were illegitimate. If that were true, the young Edward had no right to be king. In 1483, Richard made his move. He took custody of both Edward IV's sons, Edward and his younger brother Richard, and lodged them in the Tower of London, which was still used at the time as a royal residence. Then, supported by a group of powerful nobles, Richard declared himself the rightful king. Some accepted this without question. Others believed it was a calculated betrayal. After all, the boys in the tower, now known as the princes in the tower, were never seen again. Many believed they had been murdered, and though no proof was ever found, suspicion fell heavily on Richard. On July 6, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III in Westminster Abbey. He had secured the throne through legal arguments and political manoeuvring, but the way he had done it cast a long shadow over his reign, and that was only the beginning of his troubles. Richard III ruled England for just over 2 years. From the moment he took the crown in 1483, his position was uncertain. Many people questioned how he had gained power. Nobles who had once served under his brother Edward IV began to turn against him. Some feared for their own safety. Others saw an opportunity to restore the House of Lancaster, which had been defeated years earlier in the Wars of the Roses. Into this tense and divided situation stepped Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor was a descendant of the Lancastrian line through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. His claim to the throne was weak by blood, but strong by circumstance. He had spent most of his life in exile in Brittany and France, staying out of the reach of the Yorkist kings. Now, with Richard unpopular and vulnerable, Henry's supporters believed the time had come to act. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small but determined army. His goal was to march eastward and meet Richard in open battle. As Henry moved across the country, he was joined by noblemen who had decided to abandon Richard and switch sides. Richard, meanwhile, was gathering his own forces and preparing for a direct confrontation. The two armies met on August 22, 1485, near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard's army was larger and better equipped, with between 10,000 and 12,000 men. Henry's army was smaller, estimated at around 5,000, but it included experienced soldiers and commanders. Crucially, both sides hoped to gain the support of Thomas Stanley and his brother William, powerful lords who had not clearly declared for either king. Thomas Stanley was also Henry's stepfather, and both brothers had brought their own armies to the battlefield. Their decision could tip the balance. At the start of the battle, Richard took a strong position on Ambion Hill, giving him a clear view of the battlefield. His forces were organised and ready. Henry's army advanced from the lower ground. Fighting began in the early morning. Richard's troops launched the first attack, hoping to break Henry's lines quickly. But as the battle unfolded, Richard saw something that changed his plan. He noticed that Henry was not well protected. He was near the rear of his formation, with only a small group of bodyguards. Richard believed he could end the battle in one bold move. If he could reach Henry and kill him, the enemy army might collapse. So Richard decided to act. He gathered his mounted knights and led a direct cavalry charge towards Henry's position. This was a dangerous choice. Leaving his main army behind, Richard hoped to strike quickly and personally eliminate his rival. At first, the plan seemed to work. Richard's charge cut through the lines and reached Henry's standard-bearer, who was killed in the clash. But before Richard could reach Henry himself, things turned against him. The Stanleys, who had waited until this moment to pick a side, entered the battle on Henry's side. William Stanley's troops moved quickly to surround Richard's small group. Richard fought bravely, refusing to retreat. He was said to have killed several men himself and even struck close to Henry, but now he was completely outnumbered. In the final moments of the fight, Richard was pulled from his horse. Surrounded by enemy soldiers, he continued to fight on foot. He received several fatal wounds. Modern analysis of his skeleton shows that 2 large blows to the back of the head likely killed him. One was caused by a sword or similar blade, and the other by a halberd, a pole weapon with an axe-like blade. These injuries were severe enough to penetrate the skull and would have caused immediate death. After the battle, Richard's body was stripped of armour and clothing. His naked corpse was thrown over a horse with the arms and legs hanging down on either side. This was meant to humiliate him. He was taken to Leicester, where his body was displayed to prove he was dead, and with that, Richard III became the last English king ever to die in battle. Then, without ceremony, it was buried in the Church of the Greyfriars, a Franciscan friary in Leicester. The burial site was simple and unmarked. There was no tomb, no monument, and no royal funeral. The friars buried Richard in the choir of their church, but no detailed record was made of the exact spot. Over the next decades, the friary itself fell into ruin, especially after King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Greyfriars Church was destroyed, and its land was sold off and built over. Houses, shops, and eventually roads and parking lots covered the area where the friary once stood. As time passed, people forgot exactly where Richard had been buried. Stories and rumours spread, but nobody could confirm the location. Some believed his body had been thrown into the river. Others thought that the grave was lost forever. What was once a royal burial site became part of an ordinary city street. While Richard's body vanished from sight, his reputation took a very different path. The new king, Henry VII, had won the crown by defeating Richard in battle. To strengthen his claim to the throne, he needed to show that Richard had been a cruel and unworthy ruler. This made it easier to justify taking his place. As a result, writers loyal to the new Tudor dynasty began to describe Richard in very negative ways. They portrayed him as dishonest, dangerous, and power-hungry. Over time, these accusations were repeated so often that they began to seem like fact. Writers like Thomas More and the historian Polydore Virgil added more dramatic details. They described Richard as physically deformed, with a crooked back and twisted limbs, to suggest that his body reflected his evil nature. One writer even claimed that Richard was born after 2 years in his mother's womb, with teeth already in his mouth. These stories were not based on solid evidence, but they were useful for the Tudors, who wanted to distance themselves from the Plantagenet line. The most famous version of Richard's character came many years later from the playwright William Shakespeare. In the late 1500s, Shakespeare wrote Richard III, a history play that turned the late king into one of literature's most memorable villains. In the play, Richard is shown as a hunchbacked monster who lies, cheats, and murders his way to the throne. He is clever, charming, and ruthless, stopping at nothing to get what he wants. Shakespeare's Richard kills his own brother, poisons his wife, and arranges the murder of 2 young princes in the Tower. At the end of the play, he meets a dramatic and bloody end on the battlefield. Shakespeare's version of Richard was based on the stories and sources that had already been shaped by Tudor propaganda, but because his plays were so popular and widely read, many people came to believe that this was the real Richard III. For centuries, the image of Richard as a wicked, deformed tyrant became part of England's national memory. School children studied him. Painters showed him with a hunched back and dark expression. Writers and historians repeated the same version of events. The reputation stuck for a very long time. Even into the 1800s and 1900s, most people thought of Richard as the villain of the Wars of the Roses. Few questioned whether the old stories were true. The real man, who had only ruled for 2 years, who had passed laws to improve justice in the north of England, who had fought bravely at Bosworth, was mostly forgotten. With his body lost and his name blackened, Richard III became a king remembered not for how he lived, but for how he was portrayed after death. And for more than 5 centuries, it seemed that his story was over. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Yes, the world forgot where he had been buried. The only record said that he had been placed in the choir of the Greyfriars Church in Leicester, but the friary had disappeared long ago. Like many other religious houses, Greyfriars had been closed and destroyed during the reign of Henry VIII, when England broke away from the Catholic Church. After that, the land passed through private hands. Buildings were torn down, stones were taken and reused, streets were extended, and in time, new homes and shops were built across the site. By the 20th century, no one was sure where the church had even stood. Eventually, part of the area became a modern car park for Leicester City Council. Dozens of cars came and went across the spot every day, with no signs of the medieval friary that had once stood beneath the pavement. Some people guessed that the old church might be somewhere nearby, but others believed it had been lost forever, and with it, the final resting place of England's last king to die in battle. But in the early 2000s, a small group of historians and amateur researchers began to ask serious questions about Richard's burial. One of the most passionate voices was Philippa Langley, a member of the Richard III Society. She believed that Richard had been misunderstood by history and that his burial site could still be found if the right location was carefully studied. She worked closely with researchers and experts to examine old maps and compare them with the current layout of Leicester. Over time, the evidence began to point to a very specific area, a car park behind a local council building. The layout of the medieval friary, when placed over modern maps, suggested that the choir, the part of the church where Richard was buried, might be directly beneath the pavement. It was a bold theory, and not everyone believed it. The idea of finding a 500-year-old grave under a modern parking lot seemed far-fetched to many people. Still, the group decided it was worth a try. In August 2012, the University of Leicester joined the effort. With support from the City Council and the Richard III Society, archaeologists broke ground in the car park on Greyfriars Street. The project was careful and methodical, and no one expected results right away. Most people thought that, at best, the team might uncover the general location of the old church foundations. Almost no one believed they would find Richard's remains. But then something unexpected happened. On the very first day of digging, archaeologist Matthew Morris and his team opened what they called Trench 1. It was just the beginning of what was planned to be a larger excavation. Within hours, they'd uncovered human bones. At first, they only found a portion of the skeleton, just enough to know it was the remains of a man. It was located at the edge of the trench, in a spot that lined up with where the choir of the church might have once stood. As the excavation continued and the trench was widened, the full skeleton came into view. What the archaeologists saw was surprising. The body had not been buried in a coffin, it had been placed directly into the ground. There were no signs of any royal treatment, no shroud, no markers, no ceremony, but the bones themselves told a deeper story. The spine was curved in a dramatic S shape. This condition, known as scoliosis, would have caused one shoulder to appear higher than the other during the man's life. The skull had clear signs of trauma. There were deep cuts and fractures, especially at the back of the head. The body had also been buried with the hands crossed awkwardly over the pelvis, which was not a typical burial position. The team took photographs, made measurements, and carefully recorded every detail. At this point, no one was certain who the man was, but the clues were enough to raise serious questions and hopes. Had they really found what no one believed could be found? It was the beginning of one of the most astonishing discoveries in modern British history. Once the skeleton had been carefully excavated from the trench in the Leicester car park, the next step was to find out exactly who the man had been. The archaeologists and historians knew there were clues: the curved spine, the wounds to the head, the place of burial, but these signs were not enough on their own. If they were going to prove that this was Richard III, they needed scientific evidence. The bones were sent to laboratories for testing. The first thing experts did was examine the skeleton in detail. The body was male and likely in his early 30s when he died. That fits Richard's known age at the time of the Battle of Bosworth. The man was not tall, about 5 feet 8 inches in height, but the curve in his spine would have made him look shorter. Also, it would have made one shoulder noticeably higher than the other. This detail matched descriptions of Richard from the time, including several accounts that mentioned a raised shoulder. The injuries told an even more powerful story. There were 10 wounds on the skeleton. 2 of them were fatal. One blow had removed a portion of the back of the head, cutting through the bone and exposing where the brain would have been. This injury may have been caused by a sword or a halberd, a weapon with a long handle and a sharp axe-like blade, commonly used in battle. Another deep cut had entered through the base of the skull, most likely from behind. These were consistent with attacks from several enemies striking downward, which fits the historical account of Richard being surrounded and cut down in close combat after he lost his horse. There were other injuries too. A knife or dagger had sliced through one of his cheeks. Another blade had cut into his lower jaw. A wound was also found on his rib, but perhaps the most shocking injury was the one to his pelvis. A long, deep cut had passed through the right side of the pelvic bone. Experts believe this was delivered after death. The body was likely lying face down, possibly tied over a horse when someone stabbed it in the buttocks, probably as an act of humiliation. No royal burial would have allowed this kind of insult, which confirmed that the body had been handled without respect after death, just as the historical records had said. Still, physical injuries could only go so far in proving identity. The next step was DNA analysis. To do this, scientists needed to find living relatives of Richard III, But not just any descendants, because the skeleton was more than 500 years old, they needed to find a relative who shared the same unbroken maternal line. That meant someone descended through many generations of women, all the way back to one of Richard's female family members. This was the only way to make a reliable match using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to child. Years earlier, a historian named John Ashdown Hill had traced the maternal family line of Richard's older sister, Anne of York. Through careful research, he had discovered that one of Anne's direct descendants was a British-born woman named Joy Ibsen, who had moved to Canada after World War II. She had passed away in 2008, but her son, Michael Ibsen, was a furniture maker living in London at the time. Scientists took a sample of his DNA using a simple mouth swab. They also collected DNA from a second individual descended from the same maternal line to confirm the results. Then they compared this modern DNA with samples taken from the teeth and femur, the thigh bone, of the skeleton found in Leicester. The result was a match. The mitochondrial DNA from the bones and the DNA from Michael Ibsen were consistent, meaning they shared the same maternal ancestry. It did not prove identity alone, but it added strong weight to the evidence. Combined with the age of the man, his physical condition, the nature and location of the wounds, and the place of burial, the case became extremely convincing. In February 2013, the University of Leicester held a press conference. After months of study, testing, and careful review, the lead researchers announced their conclusion. The skeleton found beneath the Leicester car park was, beyond reasonable doubt, that of King Richard III. In 2015, more than 5 centuries after his death, Richard III was finally laid to rest with full royal honours. His remains were placed in a tomb inside Leicester Cathedral, just a few steps from the very car park that had hidden him for so long. The service was attended by royalty, clergy, historians, and thousands of people who had followed his incredible journey from battlefield to burial to rediscovery. From a lost grave to a global story, Richard's return reminds us how much history still lies beneath our feet, waiting to be found. But what do you think? Was Richard III a villain, a victim, or something in between? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories from history. Some you know, and others you won't believe are real.